Hi everyone, I am Joe Nellis from Cranfield School of Management, and I have to say it is a great honour and a pleasure to be with you today, giving you a presentation on the prospects for the global economy after this terrible COVID crisis. But there's a lot of questions I'm sure you want to ask me, and so I just want to say hello. As I say, this is me. And I hope you're all keeping well and you're safe during this crisis. I've got a few slides to share with you, and let me just put this up right now. Here we are. And so, in terms of this crisis, there are so many questions we're all facing, and I guess the most important question up front is, how deep and how long will the global recession be? Well, the good news is we're already coming out of the global recession. And the really good news is we are not going to have a depression. A depression is defined as at least 2 years, 8 quarters of negative GDP growth. And that is not going to happen. So I think that's a great relief. Of course, you're all from around the world, and you'll be concerned, as I am, about which regions will be particularly most negative and which will be least negatively affected. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of that as we go through this session. But there's so many aspects of this, I have to limit what I say for obvious reasons. I have a particular view that this crisis is going to accelerate some of the changes that were already beginning to emerge in terms of international trade relationships. And I want to focus on that particular point later in this presentation. Of course, this crisis will have implications for long-term growth for many economies. Some economies will not recover as strongly as would normally have been the case. At the same time, I think some economies will actually come out of the recession in, well, I won't say better shape, but in a more sustained path. But as I say, you must have lots of questions to ask, and I'm going to consciously try and leave enough time at the end for you to ask those questions. I'm going to make an apology up front for all economists in this current situation. Niels Bohr in 1922 said, "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." And that has never been more true than it is today. That's right across the world. If anybody has perfect forecasts right now, please speak up and tell me about them, because forecasts are changing so quickly. And to highlight that point, let me just go back to January this year. It's remarkable to think that just in January, the IMF forecasts were really quite positive for the world economy in 2020 and 2021, as you will see. The advanced economies were projected to grow rather slowly this year and next year, and I think for many years to come. And the emerging markets and developing economies were forecast to pick up their pace of growth. But this was such a long time ago, just last January, and how the world has changed since then. I will, of course, update these for you. But before I do that, let me remind you of what has happened to all of us in the last 6 or 7 months. We've had shocks across the globe, both on the supply side and on the demand side. We've had disruption in global supply chains in so many sectors. And of course, we've had, in many countries, a dramatic decrease in the supply of labour for lots of reasons, because of quarantine, obviously, social distancing and lockdowns in a number of countries. Not in every country, but in many countries. And we've had a tremendous fall in business confidence. That, to me, is a worrying development, which I want to emphasize in a few moments, because, business needs to be confident if we are to see an increase in investment spending. And so on the demand side, not surprisingly, there's been also a fall in consumer confidence, and a lot of uncertainty continues around the world. Uncertainty about the disease itself and whether or not we're going to have a successful vaccine. There's also concern about whether or not government policies and central bank policies around the world will be successful in pulling the world economies out of recession and back onto a sustainable growth path. Of course, with lockdowns and social distancing, and as well as many companies having trouble, there is a loss of income for many workers around the world. This crisis has led to a sharp downturn in global per capita income, but that will be short-lived. That will be short-lived. Of course, as consumers have become more cautious, so we've seen an increase in precautionary savings. Not many of us are traveling around the world on holiday, on planes or in ships, but we are holding on to our money, and that's not a big surprise. But I mentioned business confidence a few moments ago, and with that, of course, has come a sharp decline in many countries, a sharp decline in investment spending. And you will all know that economists like myself, we focus on a particular cliche when we talk about investment spending. Investment is the engine of growth. That's why I'm very concerned about the slowdown in investment spending in many advanced economies in particular, as well as in many other parts of the world. Investment spending on infrastructure, on technology, on education, on roads, etc., etc., etc. This is a serious question for all of us. To what extent can our governments reverse a slowdown in investment spending? It's essential for long-term growth. In terms of government responses, not every country has done the same thing, but there's a common thread right across the world. We have seen unprecedented spending by governments in order to avoid a global economic depression. And as I said a few moments ago, the good news is we are as sure as we can be that there will not be a global depression. Thank goodness for that. If I just take two areas alone, the USA and the Eurozone countries, they're only two regions of the world. The governments of those two areas alone have committed already $7.4 trillion, with much more to come. If I take a global perspective, there are many more trillions of dollars that have been pumped into the world's economies to avoid a global depression. Although, of course, we have not avoided a global recession. We've also seen central banks across the globe react by reducing short-term interest rates, which are now at record lows. In the UK, for example, our base rate is now 0.1%. And some economies have even gone to negative interest rates, whereby commercial banks have to pay the central bank money in order to deposit their spare reserves with them. Quite incredible. And of course, we've seen significant quantitative easing around the world. And just to explain why that has been so important, quantitative easing happens when central banks buy government bonds that are in the market already. They buy them from commercial banks, from pension funds, from insurance companies, from large corporates. In buying existing government bonds, in doing that, the central bank is pushing up the price, the market price of those bonds, which of course pushes down the yield on government bonds. So we now have the yield on 10-year government bonds across the world as low as they've ever been. I think that's true, actually. In Europe, for example, government bond yields in Germany are about 0.4%, in the UK about 0.8%, and right across the globe, exceptionally, historically low government bond yields. But remember my earlier point, this is to try and help, to try and encourage, to try and stimulate corporate borrowing and corporate investment. We need to keep a focus on the importance of investment spending. Of course, low bond yields has also made it, well, rather cheap, inexpensive for governments to borrow, and so they have borrowed. And some governments have also, of course, paid workers' wages, they've provided inexpensive loans, and they've bailed out some sectors. So, for example, the German government has bailed out Lufthansa. And I suspect many governments around the world will have to do likewise for some of their major companies and sectors. I mentioned government borrowing very, very briefly, just to highlight what has happened in the last few months. Here we have on the left-hand side the change in government debt globally. The key point I want you to notice is that the extent to which national government debt, government borrowing, the extent to which the debt levels have gone up during this crisis are almost double the amount of extra borrowing that happened during the global financial crisis. So governments really have learned a lesson. Borrow quickly and spend quickly. The right-hand side of this diagram shows the annual borrowing. So the left-hand side is the stock of debt. The right-hand side is the annual borrowing, the fiscal balance. And once again, globally, you'll see that the extent to which governments have increased borrowing this year is roughly forecast to be roughly double what it was during the global financial crisis. So governments did learn something 10 years ago during the global financial crisis. I said I'd come back to an update on the IMF figures, and these are the latest figures from the IMF. One key point I'll mention is that the IMF at the moment are no longer providing 5-year forecasts, which is what they normally do, because there is so much instability in the data right now. So this is the best guesstimate of what's going to happen this year and next year. And you'll notice the IMF are stating that this is a crisis like no other and an uncertain recovery. We're not out of this by a long way. This year we expect the global economy to have a downturn of about almost 5%. And then there will be an upturn next year. The upturn has already begun as lockdowns have eased, as people have gone back to their workplaces. And you'll notice that the classic V-shaped recovery that is so often talked about these days. However, the advanced economies this year are forecast to fall collectively by about 8%. Now, there's no guarantee of this. This is a forecast. There will be some uncertainty in that forecast. But even if it's approximately correct, this is going to be the biggest recession, well, since the 1930s and perhaps even before that, in 1 year. The Great Depression, of course, of the 1930s lasted for several years, but this is a 1-year hit during 2020. And there will be a bounce back next year for the advanced economies, but note, the bounce back will not be as big as the fall this year. And that is an important point to remember. In the emerging markets and developing economies, I think there's some good news here, that the recession this year for the emerging markets and developing countries is only forecast to be about 3%. I say only, that is still, a critical factor for many poor countries. But nevertheless, we are expecting to see a bounce back next year, which should be significant, a large bounce back, because as advanced economies recover, then we expect many developing economies and emerging markets to benefit from an increase in their exports to the advanced world. Again, just food for thought at the moment. I mentioned the V-shaped recovery, and I suspect you've all heard about the different possible shapes of recovery that may happen this year. The V-shape is the one we're all hoping for, that we've gone down quickly and we go back up quickly. I personally don't think that will be the case in every part of the world. I think a number of economies may well experience the right-hand side of the V being less steep. In other words, a shallower recovery. I think for a number of countries, a U-shaped recovery is more likely. In other words, there will be a more prolonged trough before a return to the previous level of economic activity. I fear a W shape, of course. And here in the UK and in Europe generally, and in the USA and many other parts of the world, there is growing concern of a second surge of the virus and possibly another lockdown for a number of countries, in which case the recovery that we're now beginning to see may well lead back again to another recession, a W shape. I really don't want to mention the L-shaped well, it's not a recovery, but L-shape would be a drop to a new normal. I always say L is hell. In other words, the Great Depression of the 1930s was an L, where the world economy remained at a lower level for several years. I really hope this is not the case around the world, but I fear there will be some countries that may well experience this, and I hope it doesn't apply to where you are today, of course. Now, today, this morning in this presentation, I think this is perhaps the most important slide that I will show. Again, these are simply forecasts, but I've also been checking a similar picture by the World Bank and many other organizations, and most forecasting organizations are predicting a similar pattern of recovery. And look at this picture very carefully. The yellow line represents China. China, you'll notice, went into recession very quickly before other countries and had a very sharp V-shaped. But China is already recovering. And I want you to notice where the yellow line crosses the 100 line. In other words, China is probably already back to a size, an economic size, that it was at the start of 2019. In other words, it's regained already what it lost during the last 6 months or 9 months. And the forecast for China for the coming years shows strong, sustainable growth. If you look at the blue line, it shows the advanced economies. And the IMF and many other organizations are predicting that the advanced economies are experiencing a sharper decline, a deeper recession. And look at the right-hand side of this graph, the blue line. In other words, recovery will be less sharp, less pronounced. And it's predicted that the advanced economies may not get back to the size they were at the start of 2019, perhaps until sometime in 2022. In other words, even by the end of 2021, I think many of the advanced economies will still be struggling to recover from the effects of this virus. Again, I personally celebrate the fact that the emerging markets and developing economies are predicted to grow on a sustained basis. But nevertheless, it's unfortunate that they may not get back to the size they were at the start of 2019, perhaps until the start of 2021. I regret that, and I hope the emerging markets and developing economies somehow manage to grow quicker. I said, to me, this is a very important slide. I want to refer back to the implications of this in a few moments. Before I do that, let me just whiz around the world, I guess to make you all feel engaged wherever you may be based. Again, these are only IMF forecasts. I keep saying that, but remember, they spend a lot of money on these forecasts, certainly more money than I've got to spend, and therefore I think there is a degree of credibility which we can accept. So very briefly, the IMF this year predicts that USA will have a sharp decline for 2020 as a whole, perhaps 8% fall, and a bounce back next year, but that will not make up for the fall this year. Similarly for the Eurozone, but the Eurozone will have a bigger fall this year, we expect. And the Eurozone is having a number of problems, both political and economic, and a bounce back next year, but again, it will not make up for the fall this year. Japan, a fall this year, perhaps 5.8%, and a small recovery next year, which is, I think, unfortunate for the new Prime Minister of Japan, just announced today. And the UK, a significant fall this year of perhaps 10%. And I've seen forecasts which predict an even bigger fall for the UK this year, and a recovery next year. But again, once more, it will not make up for the fall this year. In terms of emerging and developing Asia, really good news. So if you're based in this part of the world, in emerging and developing Asia, congratulations. You've done very well. You're expected to do very well this year with only a small recession. Of course, that's for the countries collectively. There may be one or two exceptions, but a significant increase in growth next year is forecast. And I congratulate you if that happens, and I hope it does, by the way. Emerging and developing Europe, again, will fall this year and bounce back up next year, almost as much. The recovery will be almost enough to compensate for the fall this year. Middle East and Central Asia, sharp fall followed by recovery. And then Saudi Arabia, of course, has a fall this year. And the reason why I've picked on Saudi Arabia is because of the oil market. There will be a significant increase as recovery gets underway. Then I expect oil prices to recover, and therefore Saudi Arabia will benefit from that. But that's a very brief summary. And by the way, you can check all of these figures yourselves. You can generate them yourselves just by going to the IMF WEO, World Economic Outlook webpage. And they will update these very soon. Now, just to finish my views about the developing economies, sadly, I said earlier, not every economy will see recovery at the same pace or at the same time. There are a number of regions in the developing world which are facing significant risks from the Covid-19 crisis, and I'm sure some of you are well aware of this. Parts of Africa, in particular South Africa, is really having a very hard time. Parts of South Asia, of course, collectively all doing well, but there are some exceptions, I said earlier. And Latin America in particular, I'm very concerned about Brazil and its ability to deal with this crisis and therefore to put itself on a recovery path. Because many parts of the developing and emerging world, they have lower health sector capacity. Intensive care units and ventilators are a luxury in some countries. We all should be very concerned about that. And, you know, less access to the simple product of clean water, just to wash your hands. For many people in Africa in particular, this is a crisis that's been with them for many, many years. And now that problem is really causing an even bigger crisis in terms of health. And of course, many parts of the developing world and some emerging markets are vulnerable to global trade cycles. Although I did say earlier, I think some countries will perform very well as global trade recovers. But, you know, particular countries that are exporting commodities which are not able to add value to their exports, they are dependent on the advanced economies, of course. And, you know, here we are today having a Zoom call and a conference. We're fortunate we have access to the internet, but that's not the case for many millions of people around the world who simply cannot work from home or have Zoom sessions from home. So I am concerned that many people are going to struggle for quite some time. And sadly, the gap between the richest and the poorest is likely to widen even further as a result of COVID-19. And that grieves me deeply. Now, I said earlier that there was the graph that shows the forecast for China and the advanced economies and the emerging markets. I said I want to come back and refer to that. That graph, it gives me a feeling that we are going through a change in the global economy that is taking place faster than otherwise would have been the case. I think COVID-19 is going to accelerate some of the changes that were already happening. And I'm going to refer to this as changing the spheres of influence. Let me explain what I mean. Clearly, the USA is a major sphere of influence in the world. And I also associate with that the countries that are closely aligned with the USA. So think of Canada and Mexico in terms of NAFTA, for example. But this sphere of influence, in my opinion, while it's not going to diminish, but it is going to change, and it is already changing. I see the USA at present looking somewhat more inward rather than outward. Some may even see more protectionist rather than a supporter of globalization. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's a mistake. And I hope that the USA does grow to become much more supportive of international trade. You may find that to be critical. It's a marginal change taking place, but I'm concerned about it. Of course, the EU is a major sphere of influence, equal in economic size approximately to the USA, with a bigger population. But the EU, as a sphere of influence, is definitely, at the moment, diminishing. One particular reason is the UK has left the EU, and we're in the middle of negotiating a Brexit deal. And that diminishes the EU as a sphere of influence in itself. But also, countries in southern Europe are struggling economically and have struggled for some years since the global financial crisis, and I think will continue to struggle, sadly, for some years to come. And so we have a north-south divide in the EU at the moment. And again, I think that negatively impacts its sphere of influence across the world. And thirdly, and not surprisingly, China is a major sphere of influence, and it's growing. And of course, I associate with China those countries that are reliant and aligned to China. In that case, I would include Russia and many other countries. Now, I have a prediction to make. I predict that China, as a result of COVID-19, will actually increase its sphere of influence because China has the reserves. China has the ability to help many more countries to come out of this crisis. And so I expect China strategically to increase its investments in Africa, in Latin America, and many other parts of the world. If I were the Chinese government, that's what I would focus on right now. What a great time for China to help more countries to grow, particularly in the developing world. But in so doing, it will increase China's sphere of influence. And therefore, these three spheres of influence, in terms of relative importance, I think they're going to change faster than otherwise would have been the case as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. You may disagree, of course, but as an exam question, I would encourage you to think about what I'm saying and to ask yourself the question, is the COVID-19 crisis, will it have implications for international trade and for the balance of power? My view is yes, but that's a good exam question for you to consider back in your business schools, of course. I hope you will enjoy discussing that. In terms of the global outlook, let me therefore just summarize very briefly. We're expecting to see a shrink in global GDP of almost 5% this year. That's more severe than we saw 10 years ago during the global financial crisis, but we are already witnessing a rebound, just beginning to see a rebound, although the picture is mixed across the world. But we will see a V-shaped recovery for many economies, for every economy, I suspect. But it's the pace of that recovery that I'm concerned about, particularly in the advanced economies. So much depends on whether or not we can discover an effective vaccine and whether we can slow down this pandemic. As I said earlier, in many countries, there are signs of an increase in the rate of infection, and we do not yet have a vaccine available for use. As I say, we're all hoping and praying that will come in the next few months. Let's wait and see and keep our fingers crossed. And for a number of economies that are going through this, we're all going through this crisis, but for some economies, there is a danger of what's become known as a scarring effect, that there may be a permanent mark on some economies. And let me explain that. The scarring effect arises when unemployment rises, and that then leads to even higher unemployment, and therefore there's a danger of a permanently higher jobless rate. So in other words, long-term unemployment may increase in a number of economies. And some people may not actually be back in work for some years. And that will lead to a significant scar. And of course, the slowdown in investment spending I mentioned has an impact on productivity growth. Investment is the engine of growth. So if companies are holding back on replacing their IT systems, if they're holding back on training programs, if they're holding back on investing in people, if they're holding back in investing on new infrastructure and new buildings, that will impact future productivity growth. And I am concerned about that, and we all should be concerned about that. There's also a danger in those economies which have got a welfare system, that people will become more dependent on welfare. And those that haven't got a welfare system will become more dependent on their families if unemployment is permanently higher in a number of countries. Of course, this is not going to be the same in every country. It will be different in different countries, for different sectors and different age groups. My particular concern is for the younger populations in countries that may face unemployment longer than they otherwise would have expected. And the danger, of course, is that leads to what's called hysteresis. It literally means to fall back, to lag behind. It will take longer to get onto the career path, longer to start their lives properly. So there is some worry here for a number of people around the world, which we should all be worried about. And then, of course, some countries and some people and some sectors are going to go through, I think, new normals. This has become a very popular phrase. It's a phrase I've used for more than a decade. And it's sad that it's emerged now in this crisis. But let me explain what we mean by this. And I'm only going to choose one example. I think, again, another good exam question for you would be to consider what other new normals do you think will emerge in sectors and in countries around the world? And how will that shape the business environment of the future? Let me take remote working as a possible new normal. Here we are today having a Zoom call. This is a new normal with perhaps 400 people watching and listening. To what extent will this be a permanent new normal for some sectors, for some businesses, for some people. I personally am enjoying it, and I don't mean to sound, strange. It creates such flexibility. I'm connecting with you, as close as we can be, and that's wonderful. I wish we could do more of this. So it does offer flexibility, of course it does, and of course it offers lower costs for business. I'm concerned about investors in office blocks in a number of countries. I'm not sure if all office workers will be going back to their offices. I'm aware of some banks in London who've already said to their workers, if you can work from home, work from home. And in fact, we'd like you to stay at home permanently if you wish to. And that's beginning to happen, I'm sure, in many parts of the world, not just in London. And this offers tremendous opportunities for digital business and digital learning, for all of us. As I say, today's an example of this. And at the same time, of course, in a number of cities around the world, it has meant less congestion and less pollution. We can hear the birds sing, and the peace and quiet is wonderful. But of course, that's from my personal perspective. But it does have implications for people's health, less pollution and less congestion. But it's not all good news. I'm absolutely aware of that. I'm not taking a one-sided view, because the opportunities of remote working are not equal across the world. You and I listening here today and watching today, we're fortunate. We're very lucky. The more highly skilled workers clearly find it much more easy to do remote working. There are so many differences by sector. If you work on a building site, it's very difficult to work from home. If you serve meals in a restaurant, it's very difficult to work from home, obviously. And there are so many examples that I could give you. And therefore, there are differences by occupational groups and differences, of course, by income groups. And I repeat my earlier point, I am gravely concerned about the gap growing between the haves and the have-nots, between the rich and the poor. We have already got serious problems with income inequality around the world. Sadly, I think COVID-19 will widen some of these gaps and cause social pressures, more pressures than otherwise would have been the case. So in summary, and I'm going to leave, at least 10 minutes for Q&A. I've given my excuses earlier. Economic predictions at the moment really have got a wide margin of error, and some of the statistics are startling. I've taken a global perspective. You will no doubt have your own regional and national perspectives. So much of what happens next is going to depend on social distancing until a vaccine arrives. And as I say, let's hope it happens, and let's hope it's effective. That's critical. Most economists, most forecasters are predicting, the sharp fall has happened, and most are predicting a swift recovery. But remember what I said, the pace of that recovery will vary, I believe, around the world. And I think the advanced economies will have a slower recovery than many other parts of the world, including the emerging markets, especially China. And so much depends on the economic policies that have been implemented. And governments around the world have borrowed a tremendous amount of money, both nationally and internationally. Government support is critical, and I really hope that governments do not turn off the taps too soon, because to do so will have longer term implications. At the same time, the scale of government borrowing does mean that we are passing on a debt, a national debt, to the next generations to come. And that will have longer term implications, of course, which we're going to have to deal with sooner rather than later. So on that note, I'm now going to stop sharing my slides and go into a Q&A session. We have a good 10 minutes, I believe, to have Q&A. So I hope you've appreciated, I hope you enjoyed what I've said, but I know it's controversial, and so I'm now going to take Q&A.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for that. Yeah, spot on, actually. 10 minutes exactly to go. So let's get into the questions. There's a group of students on the line from Brazil, and they wondered if you could perhaps share a bit more of your concerns about how the impact of COVID-19 might develop in their country and their economy.
Yeah, and hello in Brazil. I've been there many times. I spent my 25th wedding anniversary in the Copacabana Beach Hotel, and I love the place, and I've taught there many times, and I really feel for you. the COVID-19 has really hit you very, very hard. And around the world, we look on and we are confused about your president's policies in dealing with COVID-19, but I'm not here to be political. My biggest concern for you is what I just said a few moments ago. Sadly, I think the poorest people in Brazil are going to struggle to emerge from this crisis. And I think the gap is going to get wider and wider. So I'm afraid at the moment, all of the forecasters around the world, including myself, and I know Brazil reasonably well, I think the view is that it's going to be a long haul. And I think it's going to take several years before you begin to feel the sense of recovery. When I say several, I mean 2, 3, or 4 years. And that's not good news. And so I wish you the very best. And I hope the virus is under control as soon as possible. And I hope you recover as soon as possible. Graham.
Thanks, Joe. So looking at quantitative easing, Joe, there's a question here about whether or not that will help to negate any potential recessions caused by COVID, like it did in the 2008 financial crisis, especially on the global stage.
Well, I think QE, has been absolutely essential. Remember, the purpose of the quantitative easing, this one single aim of QE is to drive down bond yields. Now, so the good news is we have driven down the cost of borrowing for long-term investment, for government borrowing, etc. There is a downside to QE, of course, because by driving down bond yields, the sector which relies most on government bond yields is the pension sector. So pension funds around the world who hold a great quantity of government bonds are going to be earning very little because the bond yields are so low. So there's a downside. The affordability of future pensions is not good news. But look, in this crisis, there was no choice. QE was essential. And at some point, of course, it will end, although I don't see that ending any day soon, because I think this crisis, economic crisis, is with us for the next 2, 3, or 4 years, and perhaps even longer than that in some parts of the world. Thank you, Graham.
Thanks, Joe. There's a question here. Where do you think emerging economies should focus their attention to accelerate recovery growth as fast as possible?
Well, I think they already are doing very well. So let me make that very clear. I think emerging markets, particularly China and India, have got tremendous prospects, and many other emerging markets. So I think what they've done in particular, in moving from developing status to emerging market status, the primary mechanism is to start creating more added value. Now that's an important point. In production of goods and of course services, you're adding value. I compare that to many developing economies which are exporting commodities, including oil, by the way, but not refining the oil, or exporting fruit, but not creating processed fruit and so on, and canned fruit. So I would suggest that emerging markets do what you're doing. I think you're doing a great job, and of course your internal economies are also responding. As the economy grows, so incomes rise, so the circular flow of income begins to accelerate. But compare that to developing economies. My plea is to developing countries: add value, add value. Thank you, Graham.
So you've talked a bit there, Joe, about that we're on the road to recovery, and we're certainly hoping to avoid a depression. COVID potentially will be stronger in the winter months. Is that something that's been factored into your thoughts around the economic recovery? And is it maybe offset a little bit by how we've changed our working practices?
Great question, by the way. First of all, can I just say that all of the forecasts at the moment that are being produced by various organizations are based on the best information I have available. They are generally, and the IMF, for example, they are not predicting a second lockdown. But that's why I said earlier, many organizations are no longer producing long-term forecasts, because everything may change in the next 1, 2, 3 months. So what I produced today for you is a summary of the best estimates. Therefore, if the winter months in a number of countries leads to a second wave of the virus, and a second lockdown, then I'm sorry to say we could be in a worse situation. That's why, I mean, by the way, those of you who know me, and there's a small number online today, will know that I'm probably the most optimistic economist on the planet. So if I'm worried, it means others are really worried. And I think the second lockdown in the winter, possible wave of the virus would be a serious dilemma. And therefore that will have implications for where we work, how we work, home working again. That will slow down economies once more. I just hope this virus and the vaccine, I hope the vaccine arrives as soon as possible. But it will take, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical person, but I cannot see any significant change for at least 6 to 9 months. But I'm not trying to be scientific when I say that. Thank you, Graham.
No problem, Joe. We've got 4 minutes on the clock left. There's a question here. How do you think the results of the USA voting in November will change Chinese influence on the world?
Yeah, that's I wondered if somebody would ask that question, because I was hinting at it earlier when I said that I think the US has been looking more inward than outward. And of course, I was particularly hinting at the position that the president of the US has taken in the last few years regards globalization and regarding China. There's no doubt there is an air of protectionism that has built up in the last few years. Now, I'm not going to be political, but I think if Donald Trump is reelected, then I think that protectionist mindset will continue. I can understand it, by the way. I understand it perfectly. If you want elected and you tell the people of the USA that you're going to look after jobs in the USA, you're not going to let globalization erode those jobs, that will be popular in some parts of the USA, in some states. But I think the consequence is, and I think not surprisingly, China will look even more for widening its sphere of influence in many other countries of the world, and is able to do deals. Remember, China has more dollar reserves than any other country in the world outside the USA. And I congratulate China for its economic success. But China thinks long term, and I respect that. I think at the moment, the US is thinking short term, in my opinion. So I think China is going to become stronger, and therefore I hope that certainly the UK can negotiate some good trade deals with China and with the USA, of course. Thank you, Graham.
No problem, Joe. So another question here. For developing countries such as South Africa, it's been stated that the missed academic year is going to have a massive impact on the economy in the future, so 10 years potentially down the road. Do you have any thoughts or insights on how or why that might be?
Yes, and I did mention South Africa earlier. What a wonderful, beautiful country. And I fear for it as a result of COVID-19. I mentioned the access to ICUs for ventilators, etc., etc. And so a year out of education is a crisis. Back to my earlier point, which I'll repeat, investment is the engine of growth, and that includes investment in education. South Africa, has a wonderful potential future because of the resources, because of the people. But a year out of education, I think, will knock it back significantly. I will knock back a generation significantly, and I hope that doesn't happen. But sadly, I am worried about South Africa, and I hope you do well, please. Thank you, Graham.
Hey, Joe, less than 50 seconds to go, so a really, really quick one.
Yep.
In your opinion, how can we reduce the gap between the rich and the poor?
Wow. Well, first of all, I would want all governments to ensure they collect all taxes from all companies, all corporates around the world. There's so many companies that are avoiding paying taxes through offshore accounts, through tax havens, through relocating reallocating their profits back to low tax areas. I personally don't agree with that. I think it's essential that governments collect the taxes that they need to collect from those people who should be paying their taxes. That absolutely is correct. And therefore, I would use tax collection as a way of helping the poor people. And it may well be that we end up with, in some countries, universal basic incomes funded by corporate taxes. And I see the time is up. And folks, I wish you all the very best. I'm about to say goodbye.